We're going to continue our scriptural case for conditionalism in Genesis 3. And Genesis 3, in summary, is what's known as the fall, the explanation of why humanity and its relationship with the world is the way it is, why there's suffering, why there's violence, and what the hope is as well. There's a glimmer of hope in Genesis 3, which I'll touch on briefly, but just to remind ourselves of the purpose of this is to answer the question, what does God's judgment look like? And how does that relate to the doctrine of hell? So while there is hope in this passage, that's not the focus of this series. So I want to just emphasize that at the start. Right at the start, we have the snake talking with Eve, and there's two lies that the serpent has. The first one, Eve catches, and that is the serpent saying, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? And Eve says, well, no, God has told us to eat from any tree in the garden except the one in the middle. You must not eat of that tree or you will die. And the second lie comes from the serpent saying, you will not certainly die. Well, God said, you will certainly die. The serpent counteracts that with, you won't. You will have your eyes opened and you'll know what is good and evil. And the woman then sees the tree is good for food and pleasing to the eye, and takes and eats and then gives some to Adam. So she's deceived by the snake that she won't certainly die. She believes him rather than God. And we end up with the mess, the curse. So we move on through Genesis 3 and we have the hope. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers, and he will crush your head and you will strike his heel. This is a picture of the Messiah for Jews and Christians, I believe, both, but we see that as a moment of looking towards the cross. Jesus takes on the curse that we'll look at in more detail in a moment, defeats it, but is wounded by it. And while the sin and the serpent and death are crushed by the cross, Christ is obviously wounded by having to go through death and defeating it. And that's important, actually, because what is the curse? Well, the curse ultimately is death. We have this statement, by the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and for dust you will return. Now, going into the discussion around hell and God's judgment, many traditionalists will argue that everyone lives forever. And I've given some examples in previous talks. We have John Piper, we have Billy Graham. I've looked at a Mark Driscoll sermon he says this. C.S. Lewis says this. This is fairly core doctrine for many people, that you will live forever in one location, be it hell or heaven. But to read this, they then have to say, well, this is a spiritual death. It's a separation. Sure, the body dies, but the soul continues to live on. But you have to read that into the text. Now, Genesis 3:22 is vital for this, because God expels them from the garden, puts a cherubim and a flaming sword so that they cannot have access to this tree of life. Why? So that they shall not live forever. Now, as I said, I've quoted multiple people that say everyone lives forever. But what Genesis 3:22 says is that people will not live forever in a state of sin. So God's ultimate purpose is to rescue people from death. And we'll look at verses where that's explicitly stated. There is also responsibility on the human side of things to not be deceived. And we'll look at that in future verses. But what is clear here is that those who defend the eternal torment view of hell must deal with the language in this passage, and not just read into this passage something like spiritual death, where the spiritual death actually means living forever in hell. Living forever in a state of sin isn't his purpose. It is either a life forever with the tree of life, or death. And that's why it's called conditional immortality, that our immortality is conditional on God rescuing us, on God giving us access to the tree of life so that we might take, eat, and live forever. It cannot be a spiritual death, which actually means a forever life. I'll leave that with you. Let me know your thoughts. See you later.